Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study Series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We are starting a brand new series with this video.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, we're doing
what book we doing?
Book of Judges. And we'll do Ruth at the end of it because Ruth, as we'll note when we get there, Ruth actually happens during the time of the Judges, so it makes sense to read it. Yeah, it makes sense to read it together. But yeah, Judges and Ruth during this series.
All right, so what do we know about Judges? So chronologically, Judges comes after the book of Joshua.
Yep.
And even if you back up more at the time of Moses, which everybody knows, we're in Egypt. Moses, we come down, and Moses gets the people right to the promised land, but not in the promised land.
Right.
And then they have to go around the desert for 40 years. Moses and that whole generation dies, except for, I believe, 2 people in there, and both of those will show up.
Yep.
One is Joshua. So we then go into the book of Joshua, and Joshua is taking the people into the promised land, dividing up the land, and oh, by the way, there's some people there that we got to get rid of too.
Yeah, there are several Canaanite nations and tribes and stuff, 7 of which were so extremely wicked and pagan that they were under God's divine curse. And he said, you've got to break these 7 strongholds. The rest of the people, they can evacuate, whatever. And it takes, in the neighborhood of 5 or 6, maybe 7 years in the book of Joshua to really cover the whole land, which means they had plenty of time to leave.
Right. And I think that's 2 huge points, right? Because everybody's like, wait, there were people there and you killed them or you got rid of them.
Yep.
But, we would come back and say, God said to, it's our land. And then the second thing is for the 40 years they were wandering around the desert, 2.5 million people are noticed.
Yeah.
There's plenty of notice that, they think that the land we're on is theirs and they're coming for us. At some point in time, maybe we should move.
And then when they cross the Jordan River to come in and actually start taking over territory, there's still plenty of time to get out. There was only those 7 key places that had to be destroyed, right? So as we come into the book of Judges, there's a little bit of overlap, okay? Yep. In Joshua 24, Joshua dies. And in Judges 1, Joshua's dead. But in Judges 2, Joshua's alive again. So
we got a little flashback.
Yeah, there's a little bit of flashback going on, so don't let the timeline confuse you. We're going back and forth.
So speaking of timeline, how long does this book take?
About 300 years.
Okay.
About 300 years, which is really interesting because just space in the Bible, right? Joshua has 24 chapters, Judges has 21. They're about the same size, okay? Joshua covers about 7 years. Judges covers about 300 years. So there's going to be some detail that God has said, I'm not going to preserve you because it's going to get ugly. It's going to get really ugly in some spots in the book of Judges. If you haven't read it for a while or if you've never read it, put your seatbelt on, okay? Because there's some ugly, ugly spots. And God has just chosen, here are we were talking earlier, either the highlights or the lowlights, whichever way you want to look at it. Out of 300 years, these are the accounts that I'm going to tell you. The rest of it you don't get to know.
Right.
That's how bad things are going to get.
And there's a number of timelines as we go along. This happened for 10 years, this happened for 80 years, this happened for 40 years. Yep. But if you keep in mind a 300-year period.
Yeah, about 300 years. Some of the judges probably overlapped some and stuff. But basically we're from the time of between Joshua and Samuel. Basically, Samuel ends up being the last judge, the last major judge of Israel before Saul becomes king. So that's our time frame. There's really only about 300, maybe 350 years available.
Okay, so there's still people living in the promised land. If we go into chapter 1, Joshua is gone. So now they're trying to figure out, hey, we need to make war against these Canaanites. Who's going to lead us into war?
Yeah.
And it's a pretty big question.
Yeah.
So why is that such a big question?
Well, I think verse 1 is really important, who should lead the invasion, because God did not hand pick a successor for Joshua like Joshua was Moses' successor. Once they got into the land, God was going to be their king, and he was going to rule them through the priests. And if you remember, the Jericho, right? It was the priests and the Ark of the Covenant, and God led them into battle, and he won. So the fact that they're coming, Joshua's gone now. Who's going to lead this whole thing? God's like, well, I am, and here's the way we're going to do it. But the fact that they even had to ask that is really sad, and it really sets up the tone for the rest of this book.
Yeah, so lots of fighting, lots of death.
Yep.
I did say early on, there were two men that were held over from the time of Moses. One was Joshua, and the other was a man by the name of Caleb.
Yeah.
And he shows up a couple times, especially early in here.
Moses had promised him, when we go into the land, you can have this peace. He was one of the spies, and so was Joshua.
Yeah, and those are the only two spies that said we can win.
Right.
All the other spies said we can't, and that's what caused the 40 years.
Well, they said, God can win it for us.
Right.
But Caleb's like, while we were going through the land, I really liked that spot. Moses is like, sure, you can have it. So we're going to see the outcome of that here.
Caleb said,
we see it in Joshua. We see a little bit here in Judges as well.
Yeah. So they had some partial successes.
Yeah.
So is the problem they weren't 100% with God?
Yeah. Yeah, and we see that more in chapter 2 than chapter 1. Just sort of tells, like you said, they're partial. Here's what happened.
Yeah.
Chapter 2 really gets into more of so why did that, and in chapter 3, why did that happen? Why couldn't they, evacuate or kick the people out or destroy the people, even the ones they were supposed to destroy? To the point that the tribe of Dan was given a certain spot of land, and the Canaanites, the pagans who were in that land, not only would they not roll over and just go away, they actually fought back, and they chased Dan all the way to the northern part of Israel. They've never lived in the land that Moses parceled out to them.
Yeah. Wow.
And everybody else got some, whatever.
Right.
But the tribe of Dan was like, they were the first ones to fall into idolatry and all sorts of things. And
they were a mess.
Yeah, it really was a mess.
So even in this first week that we read, you're gonna see a pattern, and that pattern we have certainly talked about before. But it goes something like the people abandon God, and amazingly enough, God says, "Fine, if that's what you want to have happen." God gets angry and punishes the people. The people wake up and say, "Why is all this bad things happening to us?"
Usually from an outside nation, one of these nations that they let stay there, or an invading land, right?
The people cry for God's help. God brings up a deliverer or a judge.
Yep.
And since
It's
we're in the book of Judges, and the people repent and turn back to God, and everything is perfect, and then the cycle happens again.
Yeah, and not only again, but chapter 2 tells us that each time they went through the cycle, it got worse.
So
it was a downward spiral. Yeah, it wasn't
down.
Just a spiral, a circle. It was a down. Every time they turned away from God, they turned away further than their previous generation or their ancestors had.
Okay. We get into chapter 2, and in chapter 2, I think at the very beginning, it talks about the angel of the Lord came.
Yeah.
And then within that, take a note on what it says in there, where he says things like, my covenant.
Yep. I brought you out of
this.
Egypt. I did. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we had a discussion beforehand, is this an angel or is this Jesus? Because if it's an angel, I got a problem, because it's not his covenant.
Right.
So it sure sounds like this is Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. The angel of the Lord, that phrase, it's sort of it's a very important phrase in the Old Testament. The angel of the Lord, or the messenger of Jehovah, is, let's say, pre-Jesus. The eternal Son, he's Christ before he becomes Jesus. It's called a Christophany, an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. And very powerful. And we see that a lot in Joshua. We'll see that in Judges several times, where sometimes an angel shows up and he says, "Don't worship me." Sometimes this one shows up, and when somebody worships, he doesn't
He doesn't
stop
say
him.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jesus, pre-incarnate in Jesus, whatever, angel of the Lord, however you want to think about him, he says, look, I'm not going to break my covenant with you, but you must not make agreements with the people that are already living in this land, and in fact tear down all their false idols. And if you disobey, I'm not going to drive out the Canaanites.
Yeah.
I'm not going to drive out the people.
Yep.
And guess what happens? So it's really foreshadowing exactly what is going to happen.
Yeah, it really sets up a summary of the whole rest of the book.
Yeah, and then there's a sentence in here that says this generation hadn't seen God in action for themselves.
Yeah.
And if you think about it from the time of Moses, everybody saw God. I mean, so when you're God is there
In action,
You
right?
see him. Then even in the desert, he was still there. But now this generation hasn't seen God do anything.
So this would be
whole faith.
So this would be the third generation out of Egypt. The first generation comes out, dies in the wilderness. The second generation grows up in the wilderness, comes into Canaan under Joshua's leadership, takes over.
Right.
Now that generation, including
died.
Joshua and Caleb, is dead, and you've got this third generation that they've grown up in Canaan, the land of milk and honey. Everything is fine. What has God really done for us?
Right.
Yeah, it's like, come on, dude. But what that means is that second generation didn't do what they were supposed to do in reminding them this is what God did for us.
Right.
And so they were very, very quick to go away from God, which is why then every succeeding generation got a little bit worse. We still see this today. My parents were the first ones saved in their generation, and so they were like really strict and conservative Christians when I was growing up. I'm not quite as strict in certain areas as they were, but I'm still raising my kids as in a biblical foundation. They're not quite as strict as I am on certain things, and we know culture changes and everything.
Right.
But my kids are 2 generations removed from their grandparents who did not grow up in Christian homes.
Right.
And so you can see
It's
how it
easy
gets
to-
further and
but
further
yet
away.
in their life, all they've known is a Christian.
Right.
So that's, quote, the normal, and they didn't have to fight for it.
Right.
And I always think that has a play for it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's exactly, they didn't have to fight for it. They didn't come out of non-Christian homes. They didn't see this miraculous transformation in their lives. And as generations go further and further growing up in Christian homes, you start to see people turning away because it's like, well, it's just what we do. It's not theirs.
Right. So interestingly enough, I wonder if that plays into where I was going next. At the end of chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3, it says God intentionally left some of these people in the land in order to test the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
Right. If someone grows up in a Christian household, not that they never see sin, but they're going to church. Everybody is, quote, friendly.
Yep.
That whole environment is not necessarily life,
Yeah.
right? And then when you get out in, quote, the real world, some things can be, whoa.
Yeah.
Same way here, right?
Same way.
If you're in the land of milk and honey, and that's all you've ever known.
Yeah.
And this would be a pain point, right? Hey, there's some people in your land. There's some people either trying to kill you or trying to take your land back.
Yep.
You're going to have to fight for it. It means more.
Well, and remember that the mission, or we'll say the purpose, the commission, Israel's commission, we talk about our Great Commission, right? Israel's commission was to be a come and see. They were supposed to be living so differently than the rest of the world. God's presence was right there, that everybody around them was supposed to say, wow, your God is so awesome. Can we be a part of what your, what your God is doing? And they were already, as the third generation, going so far away from God that they assimilated into the world instead of being that
the world assimilating.
the world coming to them. And so, yeah, that's exactly what it was.
Yeah, and then chapter 3 is another cycle.
Yeah.
And again, the cycle is, they go away from God. God brings up, quote, a deliverer.
Yep.
Happens to be Caleb's younger brother.
Yep.
Which is kind of cool.
Either his brother or his nephew.
Is that?
Yeah.
That would make sense.
So
too.
what it says is it's Othniel, the son of Kenaz. I think it's Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. And the way the Hebrew is phrased, we're not sure if Othniel, the son of Kenaz, is Caleb's younger brother, or Othniel, the son of Kenaz, who is Caleb's younger brother.
Right.
Either way, we've got a direct blood relative of this great patriarch, Caleb. And he seems to be one of the first guys to step up at this time in Israel's history.
Well, there's a cool verse in there too, right? The Lord's Spirit empowered him.
Yeah.
At this point in time, the Holy Spirit didn't indwell with everyone, kind of came on people
individually.
Individually for a purpose.
Yep.
And that purpose would be to help in this battle.
Yeah, and we do see that with many of the judges.
Yeah.
We'll see that with Samson, and we'll see that with Gideon and some other play.
Exactly.
So they were. It was a filling for the purpose of service, which interestingly is what spirit filling in the church is as well. It's for the purpose of service, but it's different than the indwelling that we have. Yeah.
So this was a cycle. They won in battle. Israel and the land had a rest for 40 years, right? 40 years of peace. Then we're going to have another cycle.
Yeah.
We're not going to go through all these cycles.
You got to talk about the fat man.
I'm going to talk about the fat man.
One of my favorite stories growing up.
So, guy has a sword.
18 inches long. It's a
dagger.
Yeah.
No, actually, they called it a sword, and they called it a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
So it was sharp on both sides.
Yep.
And he had a secret message to give the king. King tells everybody to leave. The guy has the dagger on one of the legs, and was he left-handed?
He was left-handed,
so he had it on his right.
Left-handed. Yeah. There's a fat guy. There's a bathroom joke goes on in here. I mean, the whole thing is just.
So, anyways, the king gets stabbed with the sword, and the sword gets lost within the king, and the king goes in the bathroom and locks the door, and then the guy that did the stabbing leaves
up.
And the the people who are taking care of the king come back in, and they know that he is in the bathroom. And the bathroom had a funny name, right? It
was well ventilated.
Yeah, a well ventilated bathroom.
Which everybody wants.
And
to be
they
fair.
didn't want to bother the king, and then they finally found the king dead. So, a really long way to go, but the detail in there.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, why this? Why now? I don't know.
Yeah. It's because God can use anyone in any situation to do what to accomplish his will.
Okay, so now we get to chapter 4. Chapter 4 starts out with Deborah.
Yeah.
And Deborah is leading Israel.
Yeah.
Which, there's a whole discussion point right there.
Yeah. Not supposed to happen because the priests are supposed to be leading Israel, right? Now, she is a prophetess, which means God is talking to her. No problem with that.
Yep.
But she's not supposed to be leading. The prophets weren't supposed to be the leaders. The priests were supposed to be the leaders.
Right.
Something is falling apart.
Well, so then she is talking to a general saying, hey, you need to attack. And the general says, okay, but you have to come with me.
Yeah.
And her answer is hilarious from the standpoint of, all right, but I'm going to get all the glory.
Yeah.
And not you.
You will not get the credit for this because you're not stepping up and leading.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is there's this big discussion of women in ministry and pastors and all this stuff. And a lot of people come back to this and say, well, Deborah was leading Israel, so why can't women be pastors? First of all, the New Testament says women shouldn't be pastors. It's for qualified men only. Not even all men can be pastors. It's for qualified men. But the whole section here in chapter 4 and the next week in chapter 5 is against. The whole context is her saying, I'm not supposed to be doing this. You're supposed to be doing this.
Because you're not.
Because you're not. Yeah. Yeah, she's not standing there as this standard bearer for, women are supposed to be in charge. She's standing here saying, where are the people who are supposed to be in charge? Now, she had her role. She was a prophetess.
Right.
No problem. But she's standing there saying, guys, step up. And they wouldn't do it.
The army stepped up, though.
Yep.
From the standpoint routing the enemy, and then we find the general of the enemy army taking off in the desert.
Another one of my favorite stories.
And yeah, I don't want to get into it because
No, you got no. That's you got to read. I mean, read this. Read the detail.
Yeah.
Read the detail that's in here.
yeah, he goes into a tent.
Yeah,
we'll leave it there with that.
He takes a nap, and doesn't wake up from his nap, and God wins yet again.
Right.
So we end this week on a victory,
Right.
which is one of few in the book of Judges. Honestly, there's a whole lot more loss, especially spiritual loss, in Judges than we see a lot of victories.
Yeah. So we see the early part of the nation still trying to figure things out, still trying to carve out where they're going to live, and now this new generation that has never seen God in action, how are they going to react?
Yeah. But what's interesting is, let's not forget that every single one of these generations does see God in action. When the deliverer, the judge, rescues them, but it's like they never pass it on to their kids.
Yeah.
And that's why the cycle just keeps getting worse and worse.
Yeah, good point.
So, yeah, let's end on a victory, though.
Take 'em.
We'll take the few victories that we can get out of this book. Enjoy it. Have fun with it. If you haven't, like I said, if you haven't read this recently or at all, you're going to find some interesting things that show up in the book of Judges. But watch for those the big successes and the massive failures, and see that God is still at work in all of that, and be encouraged by that, because we have successes and failures as well. Pass this along to your family and friends if you think it would be helpful, and subscribe to the channel here, and send us your questions and comments, and we'd love to hear that, and we will pick up here next time.
Bye, everybody.